Okay, Boker Tov. Okay, so today's daf is Chafalef. We pick up on the Gemara right after the Mishnah, and and the Mishnah had listed 10 or 11. We'll actually see it's an interesting debate. Ways in which there are higher levels between Kodesh and Truma. So we're continuing to list these various levels and stratifications. Primarily, the Mishnah is focusing on difference in terms of how different things are to be treated. You know, Chulin, Maser, Kodesh, Truma, Kodesh, etc. But as we've seen, it also winds up translating into creating different groups of people, which is going to be ultimately where the Mishnayot are going in terms of how that gets effaced during the Regalim. So let's take a look, though, at the Gemara. The Gemara is going to look through these one by one. And the first one was about being Tova, Kalim, and Mikvah, that for Truma, you can put Kalim within Kalim, vessels in vessels. So you got a lot of different, let's say, bowls of different sizes, or the same size or whatever. But let's assume different sizes. You got different bowls, or you got different pots. You know how they sometimes come stacked one in the other. And can you put them all in the mikveh at once? So by Truma you can, and by Kodesh you cannot. So let's see what that is about. So the Gemara says the following: by Kodesh my time alone. Why can't you do this for if you're immersing it for the purpose of using it for Kodesh? By the way, we'll see later what would you use this for in terms of Kodesh? Like if you're Kohen, maybe you could use it to cook meat in. That would be one example. Or even if you're non-Kohen, if you're going to bring the shlamim, you could use it as a pot to cook the meat in. It will also, as we'll see, be vessels that you could use to bring the wine and the oil that comes along with sacrifices. So that would be another type of a use you would have for vessels that would be korban related. Again, I guess if you're Kohen, or you could also be the plates that you're going to be eating on and so on. Although those normally wouldn't necessarily have things to put one inside of the other. Anyway, but Kodesh my time alone. So why can't you do this when you're doing it for the purpose of korbanot? So I'm a Rabbi very simple reason, which would have occurred to me. Anybody who's brought kalim to the mikvah, you separate out the kalim because you don't want one to be weighing on the other and preventing water from getting between the two. Okay, the weight of the kli, one weighs, the inner one is its weight keeps it attached to the outer one, and therefore the water does not get between. So the Gemara says, 1 minute. But 1 minute, we're going to see another distinction between Kodesh and Truma that also deals with greater scrupulousness or greater concern around chatzitza issues. If we have a different one that's based on that, presumably you wouldn't have, if you have only a very finite, small number of things that are your distinctions, you wouldn't have two that are really variations of higher concerns of chatzitzas. Presumably you would have conflated them. So where do we see that there's a later one that's going to be about a chatzitza concern? So midiktani seifa, because we taught at the end, diktani seifa, we taught at the end, the low community Kodesh midas a truma. Kodesh is not like truma the following way. Sheba Kodesh matir uman give umatibia. By Kodesh, if you have a garment that you need to immerse, you first undo any knots in the garment, and then you dry it off, and then you immerse it. So presumably that's to ensure that the water gets on all surfaces. The achar kosher, and then if you need to retie it, you'll retie it after you immerse it. Ubetruma kosher, and by truma you can even tie it first and then immerse it, and you don't have to worry. You can assume that the water will get into it. So there you see, and that if anything is a bigger concern. You ask me, water getting into a knotted garment. So, and there we anyway have a distinction. So presumably we wouldn't have it as two separate things based on the same reason, based on the same type of concern. So the Gemara says, no, there could be two different things that are both because of heightened concerns of chatzitza by Kodesh over Truma. But tzrichan, you need to list them separately. One is not inferable from the other. The Yafmin Reisha, I had it just said the first case, Havamina Hainu Taima, the Kodesh Lo. Here's why by Kodesh purposes you can't Mishum Kvedo Shokli. The Ika, because there's literally a weight of the inner garment, inner vessel is weighing down and preventing water from getting on the surface that's between the two. I will say for but in the end, where it's not about a weight of a vessel, I would say that maybe it wouldn't be a problem. And maybe although something is knotted, if you're dealing with a type of a garment, well, garments are porous, right? Garments absorb water. So you could say, all right, it's knotted, but if the garment, what happens will be the water will get absorbed and it soaks in. So maybe there's no issue there. higher, and maybe that should not be a concern even by Kodesh. The weight of like a metal vessel or a pottery vessel, one against the other, will really prevent any water from getting there. So therefore, I wouldn't have necessarily applied it. The Akmin and safe, and had you just told me the case about the garment, Havi Amina, Hainu Taima de la Kodesh. Here's why that it's not that if you can't do it for Kodesh purposes. Because a knot gets even tighter when you immerse it in water, right? So as we all know, that'll happen, right? It'll be even tighter and harder to undo, and maybe therefore harder for the water to get into it. Aval Reisha, Demaya, but if you're dealing with two vessels, one inserted in the other, so what will happen? The water will cause the inner vessel to float. It'll get out, it'll cause it to, sort of rise up. So therefore, makfule lamana, it'll cause the vessel to float up. So lo av yechetzitza, maybe I shouldn't be concerned. Tzricha, you need to tell me both. Okay. So basic answer is yes. There are two different levels of. They are both concerns of chatzitza, which we're more scrupulous about by kodesh than by truma, and they're not inferable one from the other, and they're two different, and they are two different concerns. And by the way, because of these reasons, right, the obvious question should be: 1 minute, these seem like very reasonable concerns. Why are you allowed to do it for truma? Why aren't we concerned for truma of these things? So the Gemara has already sort of planted the basis for the answer that, yes, on one hand, they are legitimate concerns. On the other hand, you can say that normally it'll be taken care of. You dunk something in the mikveh, naturally the inner kli will rise up. You dunk a garment in the mikveh, naturally it'll get soaked. Okay, so presumably that those explanations are why it works for truma, but nevertheless we're extra scrupulous for kodesh. And yes, those are two basic chatzitza. Those are basically two different things that are based on the same reason of chatzitza concerns. That's explanation number one. Amar Rabbi Chanin, the Gemara now says, Rabbi Lo l'taimei. Now, by the way, Rabbi Lo, who explains that these are basically the same reason, is going towards another position of his. What's his other position? Damar Rabbi Ilam Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, Eser malos shanukam. There are 10 levels. There are 10 distinctions here. Now, if you count, there are really 11. Okay, and what we're saying is that by saying 2 of them are based on chatzitza, that is allowing him to turn his 11 into 10 by conflating 2 and saying that they're variations of the same. Let's just quickly count them, okay? So to remind you about what the Mishnah said. Number 1, vessels in vessels. Number 2, that when part of a vessel becomes tameh with a rabbinic tum'ah, does the entire vessel become tameh or only that section, the inside, the outside, the handle, and so on. Number 3, if you're carrying a midras, a seat of like a zav, and you're carrying truma on your other shoulder there, does the truma become tameh? Number 4, the garments of people that eat truma are considered midras for people who eat kodesh. Number 5 are where are we? This thing about undoing the garment, the knot in the garments before putting it into the mikvah. Where are we? Number 6. If you finish a vessel, even a vessel has been completed and completely, no tumah has gotten in touch with it, it's coming straight out of the potter's, oven. Nevertheless, before using it for kodesh, you need to put it in the mikvah. Number 7, a vessel, if you have like apples in a bowl, they're all considered one unit. The bowl combines them for kodesh, not for truma. Number 8, kodesh goes up to 4-level derivative, truma only 3-level derivative. Number 9, if one of your hands becomes tameh, the other is not for truma, but it is for kodesh. Number 10, where are we? If food has never become in contact with liquid and therefore is not susceptible to tum'ah, nevertheless, you still have to wash your hands for kodesh, not for truma. And number 11, that the onain and somebody who has brought a korban to end a tumah process still has to go to the mikvah for kodesh purposes, not for truma purposes. So there you have 11. But he said 10. So the point is, by conflating the two numbers, 2 and number 5, number 2 and I think it was number 1 and number 5, because number 1 was the vessel and vessel, number 5 was the knotted garment. He's turned his 11 into 10. Okay, so that's Rabbi Loi l'taimei, Damar Rabbi Loi, Ila, Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, Eser malos shanukam. They're 10, not 11. And not only is he saying they're 10, but he then also explained that they're grouped conceptually differently. Chamesh rishonos bein l'kodesh bein l'chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. This was the issue that also came up yesterday. What is the status if you always eat your chulin as if it were a korban, as if it had the kedusha of a korban? What status applies to that food? Does it get treated like kodesh in terms of its own susceptibility to tum'ah, and also in terms of the degree of care that you become obligated to treat it with? And also, what's your status vis-a-vis that food? Are you like somebody who keeps kodesh or somebody who only keeps chulin? So all of those are the questions. Okay, so he says the first 5 are bein l'kodesh, bein l'chulin shenas al taras hakodesh. Those stringencies would apply whether it's real korbanot or whether you're dealing with chulin, but you're treating it with the level of kedusha as if it was a korban. So those first 5 stringencies would apply. Achronot, the last 5 stringencies, l'kodesh avalo l'chulin shenas al taras hakodesh, only apply to real kodesh, not to chulin that was just treated as kodesh. So what's the difference? So the first thing, by the way, Tosfos points out is that this presumably is assuming that chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh lav kikodesh dami, because the statement kikodesh dami is categorical. If you're of the opinion that if you treat your chulin like kodesh, they're like kodesh, then that means for all halachas, and you don't have to distinguish. For everything, it's treated as if it were kodesh. This is a position that generally it's not. Maybe it's treated like chulin, maybe it's treated like truma, but generally it's not treated as kodesh. And nevertheless, to the first 5 stringencies, we apply those 5. So the Gemara says, "My taima, why are we more stringent for the first 5? The first 5 that are rooted in a biblical tumah, that somehow are connected to a sphere where there's a biblical tumah concern, so those will apply even to chulin that are done al taras hakodesh. Even if that chulin does not normally have it treated with the same level as kodesh, we will apply the first 5 stringencies to it. Basraisa, the last 5, the leislu drar de tumah midaraisa, that do not have a connection to biblical tumah, gazru b'rabban l'kodesh. So those last 5 stringencies only apply to real kodesh, real korbanot, or real things sanctified with the same kedusha as a korban. But l'chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh lo gazru b'rabbanan, but not for things that are not real korbanot, even if they're treated as if they were korbanot. Now, how is it that the first 5 are linked to a deoraisa concern and the last 5's not? Let me just tell you that if you're figuring out yourself, you would not have normally come to that conclusion, that the first 5 are somehow more stringent than the last. One thing Tosfos has to say in order to make sense of it is that the first 5 are not only linked to a deoraisa, but a deoraisa tumah that could apply to chulin, whereas the last 5 are linked to tumahs that might not be relevant for chulin. So just to say it over quickly, the 2 concerns we've been dealing with about dunking something in a mikvah, that obviously can connect to a deoraisa concern, because if there's chatzitzas, it prevents a legitimate immersion, even midoraisa. Okay. The other one about the inner and outer part of a vessel and so on. So although that's only about a rabbinic tum'ah, that we would chop up a vessel between the inside and the outside and the handle, but it's applying to tumahs that, as we'll see later, are based on rabbinic tumahs related to liquids. And the reason we're more strict about those tumahs is because they are based on a concern of like the spit and other types of fluids that come from a zav and so on. So again, that seems a little far-fetched because the whole tumahs d'Rabbanan, this whole idea of dividing up a vessel into different sections, is a rabbinic type of an idea, but nevertheless, because fluid tumas are linked in a doraisa concern of real doraisa fluids that are tamei, that's considered in this list of connected to a deoraisa concern. Like I said, you would not have come to this conclusion yourself. Number 3, wait, let me just go through it. Number 3, carrying a real midras, carrying a real av hatuma on your shoulder with something else. Obviously, could be a deoraisa concern that somehow those 2 could come in contact. Number 4, the idea that the garments of somebody that eats truma is considered a midras is linked to a concern that a zav, or more particularly his wife, who's a nida, would sit on it and so on. So there's a possibility of some tuma d'oraisa going on there. And we mentioned the issue about the knotted garments. And then number 5 is vessels that are made, even if there's nothing comes in contact with them, you need to dunk to a mikvah. The Gemara will say, because there's some concern that in the process of being made, maybe something tummy came in cut with it. Of course, that this sounds like a d'oraisa concern. Everything is based on some amorphous and abstract concern, right? To say that there's a d'oraisa standing behind all of this is hard exactly to see. And why the last 5 are more lenient is not so obvious, right? So, for example, The idea that a vessel combines everything inside of it, if it touches real tum'ah, does not seem like something that's so out of some ambit of a d'oraisa concern. The idea that the Tuma goes down to 3 levels by Truma and 4 levels by Kodesh, also we'll see there are d'oraisa parallels to that. That's why Tosfos has to say, but it doesn't exist by Chulin. If one hand is Tame, the other is not, that already, the idea of Tuma of hands is purely rabbinic. Dry food to have to wash your hands before dry food that never came in contact, one could say okay, because it never came in contact with liquid, it'll never be biblically tameh. And the idea of the onan and mechusik kippurim, also there's no real biblical category for them as well, for them to become tameh. But again, believe me, it is not so obvious. Some of the things in those last 5 you could easily have said are connected indirectly to a biblical one. Some of the first ones in the first 5 you could have said are not so biblically connected. Anyway, that's what the Gemara is saying. That's why we have some of these Tosfos that make the daf shorter, because how exactly that makes sense is not so transparent. Yes.
A simple question. The word Gerara, is that like go rare?
So there's Gerara means like some type of a vestige or some type of I guess Tosfos says like srach is the word that Tosfos uses elsewhere to describe what Gerara means. So you're right, srach is like something adhering, so something maybe dragging, but some clinging, some adherence of some type of a concern. Yeah, exactly. I'm interested. How does the English translate the word Gerara? I'd say like the ambit of some Tuma d'oraisa, but not exactly. Concern. Okay. Nice abstract word. All right. So anyway, back to the Gemara. Okay. So we somehow divided the first 5 and the last 5, although exactly the logic is not so clear. I mean, the assertion about what it is clear, but how the specifics fit is not so clear. And we've also said that numbers 1 and number 5 are the same because therefore we have 5 and 5 and not 6 and 5. Okay. Rava Amar mi deseifa having mishum chatzitza. Now Rava says no. Since the issue of the knotted clothes is a concern of chatzitza, reish alav mishum chatzitza. The first part about one vessel in another vessel is not a chatzitza concern. Here's the reason for the first part of the vessel for the first thing that you can't do, one vessel in another. Let's say you want to go and dunk in your mikvah some needles. Okay, now how are you going to dunk needles in a mikvah? Like nobody has ever done that because you only have to, for us, dunk things in a mikvah that you're going to use for cooking. Okay, but let's say you wanted to go ahead and dunk needles because, any type of thing, or like tiny little, toothpicks and these types of things. How are you going to do it without it all sort of getting like lost, So you fall to the bottom. So you're going to put it in a basket. You're going to put it in a vessel, but you put it in a vessel, it's going to float out of the vessel, right? They're not weight. It's like in our mikvah here, you got one of these plastic laundry baskets, right? So if your stuff is heavy, it goes to the bottom and then you pull it up and all the water runs out. Wonderful. But try doing that with needles, right? They won't necessarily fall to the bottom and you'll lose them. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to put them inside, let's say, a jug with a small hole so that, the water will go in and the needles won't be able to go out and float out. And that's how you'll do it, and that they won't go to the bottom of the mikvah. The only problem is that then the needles in the jug that are that like you have the water, you see, because he gave me because I have the whiteboard behind me, I'm going to use it. So if you've got your jug here, right, and you've got your needles here, and the water comes in, and it's in the mikvah, and the water's here, okay, and here's the water of the mikvah. So are they considered to be in the mikvah water? Is the water in here considered a continuation, like a one unit with the mikvah water that surrounds it? Or are they just, if you had a stopper in here, even if they'd be in water, it wouldn't be considered part of the mikvah water. So how big does this opening have to be in order for this to all be considered one unit of water and that they're in the mikvah water?
I would think it would make a difference as long as it's connected.
Well, you'd be wrong. So the answer is that it has to be it has to be a shvoferes hanod. It has to be the width of a shvoferes is like a tube, a straw that you would use for a canteen. A node is like a leather, what's it called? Not flask, skin, right? Like water, water flask. And so that tube is basically the width of 2 fingers. So it's got to be a circle that's basically 2 fingers, a diameter of 2 fingers, and then the water is all considered part of the mikvah water. Otherwise, it's mikvah water that got into the vessel, but it's no longer connected to the water of part of the mikvah, and therefore. But that's not the halacha. So therefore, the concern is if we let you do a vessel in a vessel, you'll come to do this when the opening won't be big enough. And therefore, in order to prevent this case when the opening is too small, we'll never let you do a vessel in a vessel for Kodesh.
You say anything for that pipe, like, connecting the water?
Yes. I mean, that's what one of this big Tosfos is about. This is a very relevant halacha that if you've got the basic way we operate our current mikvahot is, right, how do you do it so that you don't have to deal with the same dirty water every time? So you've got here you've got on your roof your thing that collects your rainwater and brings it down. Here's your rainwater. Okay, and it brings it down and it puts it into this bore, and this is the bore Megashamim, okay, and that water doesn't change. And then you've got here the mikvah that people actually go to that gets nice fresh water pumped into it, and this is all mayim she'uvim,
hopefully with chlorine
or whatever, and that's all mayim she'uvim, right? Because it's not good water, it's drawn water, it gets pumped in, and you change it regularly. And what you do is you have a connection between these two. And since this is connected to a kosher mikvah, it itself becomes kosher. If this has 40 sa'af, this is fully kosher on its own. This connection allows this to be considered part of this mikvah, and this has to be a shvoferes hanod. It has to be a pipe that's that width, and then it's considered to be all the same water. So it's the same principle that basically informs our basic construction of mikvahot. Okay, so let's take a look. So Rabbi Amar me the safe having mishum chatzitza reisha la mishum chatzitza v'reisha haina taima. Here's the reason of the reisha. Gzeu shelo yatzbi amachtim b'tzinorot b'kli shein b'fiv k'shofer sanod. We don't want you to immerse, pins and needles and other types of things that in a vessel that does not have an opening the size of a tube. This tube of a flask. Yeah, I don't know what a tzinor is. A machtin is a needle. Is a needle. A tzinor is some type of also a small cleave.
Where does the shear come
from? Halach l'moshe misinai. Keditnan, like we taught in the Mishnah. What do they say there? Spinning hook. Okay. Erev mikvaos kishvoferes hanod. There's the idea to combine. Right, to combine mikvaot, you need that the whole be the size of a shvoferes hanod of this tube. Ki ovya, like its width, ukichalala, and like it's hollow, like it's cavity. Again, I'm not exactly clear to me what ovia and chalal are different, but anyway, it presumably means all around.
Size, but let's say flat,
right, it means in both directions. To the width of two fingers, that turn around. So basically meaning like a circle of a diameter of two fingers. Okay, Savarla. So anyway, so he says it's a different reason. So now that he says it's a different reason, you can't conflate. So now we have 11 in the list. So fine. So he holds like the other version that Yudalef Malus Shanukan, that the claim that there are 11 levels mentioned in the Mishnah, not 10, because he doesn't conflate the clothes with the vessels. The vessels is not a chatzitza concern; it's this type of concern.
Does that mean if you count 10, you don't hold this halacha in terms of?
No, because there are 11. No. Well, you don't know that that's the explanation. There are 11. So you only get 10 by saying that the one about the vessels and the one about the garments is really a variation of the same, and it's a chatzitza concern. So explaining that this is not a chatzitza concern makes it 11. It keeps each one distinct and keeps you at 11 and doesn't let you get to 10. Okay. Now, but nevertheless, even though he disagrees with that, he agrees with the fundamental division into two groups. The first 6 apply whether to actual things that are sanctified with the kedusha of korbanot, or things like even chulin, if they're just treated as if they were korbanot. So these stringencies would apply to them. Achronot, the last 5, only real things with real kedusha, not with chulin that are treated as if they have kedusha. Okay, and for the same reason that somehow the first 5 have some more biblical concern associated. So now the Gemara, so that's whether you count 11 or 10, but nevertheless everybody agrees that the last 5 are in a separate category, are less weighty, a little less weighty than the first 5 or 6. Now we're going to look at the difference between what difference it gives, what difference it makes, what reason you give between whether it's a concern of a vessel and of a chatzitza, or about this concern about the pins and the needles and whatever. So what difference does it make between Rav and Rav Ila? Which reason you give? There's a difference between a basket and a other thing, which is like a large type of a basket, like a woven basket. Shemilan Kalin Bilan. So you fill them with vessels and you immerse them. Think about our case, like I said, in our mikveh here, our Kalin mikveh, you took one of those plastic laundry baskets. Well, imagine it was just made out of hemp or something, and and you filled it with vessels and you dunked it. Is that a problem or not? So if the problem is because of chatzitza, so that would be a problem. Whatever the outer vessel is, the inner vessel might weigh down. Again, we know water causes it to float. Good, that's why it's not a problem by truma. But by kodesh, we are more stringent, and that's relevant whatever type of outer vessel it is, even like a big type of a basket should be relevant. But if the concern is about needles and so on, so that you'll come to do it in some type of a vessel that has a very narrow opening, you'll never find a basket that has a narrow opening. The very nature of something's identity as a basket is a wide opening, right? That's one thing that makes it a basket. If it didn't have a wide opening, it wouldn't be a basket. It'd be a different type of a vessel. So therefore, somehow we categorically exclude baskets from this gezerah. Things that are like, pots and pans and other types of things. Something could still be a pot with a small opening, and you could have a tea kettle, and you could have those types of things with small openings, but you don't have a basket with a small opening, so that clearly would have been a category that would have been excluded. Now, by the way, it's interesting, because sometimes you hear that the Gemara says lo plug. Whatever the reason is that underlied a particular gezerah, at the end of the day, when we come to make it, we don't start saying, does it apply here, does it apply there? We just say categorically, you can never do it, right? But of course, every now and then we do say that we are going to make distinctions. It's easier to make distinctions when things can be categories, can be like lines can be drawn between categories. It's not like every single vessel you'll bring to me and I'll assess whether the gezerah is relevant. That type of thing we wouldn't do. That would be completely impossible to have a system that would run by, having to assess, each particular case, whether the reason holds. But here we're not doing that. We're saying you've got a category of vessels called baskets, which their whole definition as a basket is that it has a wide opening, right? So therefore, for that category, the gezerah never would have applied if the reason is the concern of narrow, of vessels that have very narrow openings. Okay, so that's what the Gemara would say would be a nafkamina between these two reasons. Okay, so let's take a look. So the Gemara says like this. Now, the Azda Rava l'taimei. Now, Rava goes according to his reasoning, this idea that it's about a concern of the, about the pins and needles in a vessel with a narrow opening. The Amar Rava, because Rava says, Salvigurgasni shemilan kailin vitbilan tahorin. If you have a basket that you filled with vessels and you immerse them, then they're tahor. Again, like we said, it's not a concern. It's a wide opening. Presumably he means even for Kodesh. Certainly it's true for everything else, but presumably the point is for all purposes, even for Kodesh, this is tahor because the gezerah did not apply, the mala did not apply, because this is fundamentally a vessel that has a wide opening. That's exactly what he said here. Here he's spelling out that he would hold by that practical application of his reason. Now, here's another, by the way, interesting ruling relating to this. You had a 40 sa'ah mikvah. You put in your mikvah, whatever. Let's say you put here in your bor of megishamim. You put a basket here. Okay, I don't know. We'll make it look like a basket, whatever it is. Okay, but it's a wicker basket that it's got a lot of holes. So does that divide the mikvah? Now you say you have two mikvahs. I know it doesn't look like a basket, but you get the idea. You have two mikvahs of 20 sa'ah. Or do you say, give me a break? There's all these holes in the basket. Mm-hmm. So, of course it's going to be one mikvah. That doesn't create a division.
Why did you put it on that side, not in the mikvah?
Because this is the only kosher mikvah here. This is only kosher because it connects to this. So you only would create a problem if it divided the real mikvah. Okay, so so he says that actually does divide the mikvah. Now, why is that? Because why don't you say that it's so totally porous, it's not considered a wall? So he says, no, here's why I'm not going to say that. The ha'ara kula chalchule mechalchala, because he says the whole earth is porous. Okay, so why don't I just say that any collection of water is connected to 40 that exists somewhere underground, and the whole earth is porous, and eventually water will rise up to the ground level. Okay, I understand. It's a very funny argument, right? Okay, you still need it all in one place, and this is enough to define it as two separate places, which is quite a funny argument, right? A type of a thing that it immediately runs from one side to the other is a little different than stuff that over, I don't know, even if it were days, and certainly if it's weeks and months, takes for water to, rise up through the ground. The other question is, so what's the definition then? So at what state, what would be it? Let's say you made something that was like, I don't know, but when you're making sukkahs, you can make a wall by doing just like 3 strings or like 4 strings, like each one within like 3 tefachim of another, right? So if you had something like that and you had it to divide a mikvah, so halachically it's a machitza, right? Because it's got 2.9 tefachim, between each one and thing here, whatever. I mean, I guess you have to do another one. Would that divide a mikvah? Even though it was basically all open with just a few strings. Once you say porous doesn't matter, so is it just a complete formal definition of a wall? Maybe it is. Maybe that's what Rava seems to be saying, which is quite a surprise. But but he doesn't seem to limit it. Like he says, I don't care that it's porous. Halachically, it's a wall. It's a wall.
It applies to machitza. It should apply to.
Yeah, so then something like this in the middle of a mikvah would consider to divide it. Right? By the way, you do see the emphasis here that it's totally porous. It's not like it's sort of like exactly like that laundry basket that we use. It's got major holes. That might also be the reason why the Gemara says that the gzeira of a narrow opening doesn't apply, because regardless of the opening, it's a type of a thing that's fundamentally a porous vessel. A vessel that has a lot of holes in it. So again, another reason that the gzeira of a narrow opening should not be relevant. Yes.
Entirely separate the area.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Good question. If the water went over like this, right, then the same way when you've got a little opening, it can connect, right? Water that's running on top of the surface of a wall can also connect the two sides. Yes, that is a good point.
So
okay?
if 2 large people are in the mikveh, that's still okay because.
Oh, you mean because then the people will cause the water to rise up while they're in it?
I mean because a person then couldn't divide the mikveh, right?
Oh, yeah. But also that would also be, but also on the sides as well. Yeah, but you're saying if you got a big, fat, large person in there,
You're stopping up the wall.
right? Or I guess a very narrow mikveh or something like that, right?
So how does this fit into
Say that word.
this basket part?
It doesn't. It's just a related issue about the basket. Okay.
Actually, that's not completely obvious because you might do good seek for a machitza and a mikvah.
What?
You might cause it to.
I know. That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
Okay. It actually gets discussed. Okay. Anyway. Okay. V'hani mili b'kli tahor. Now, this issue about the problem of a narrow opening in the vessel is if the outer vessel was tahor. But if the outer vessel was tamei, this is interesting. It actually becomes more lenient. Miga de salka tefila lukula gufe demana, because the tefila works for the outer vessel, for the whole body of the vessel, the outer vessel. Salka luhumana nami lekelim de ispa bay. It also works for the vessels that are in it. Let's read the case and then I'll spell it out. Titnan, because we're talking the Mishnah. Kalim shemilam kalim. No, before I read the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is going to require a little bit explaining. So let me say what that means. So basically, here you go. Here's your vessel with a very narrow opening. Now, and here's your little whatever, your needles. Okay, this is tameh. So now water gets in here. Okay, so water gets in here, but it's a very narrow opening. So it's not considered. Forget the vessel on the inside. You take your yes, it's less than a shvoferes hano. Okay, but nevertheless, even though it's less than a shvoferes hano, so it can't be considered like all part of the same mikvah water. Nevertheless, you have to be able to tovel this vessel, right? We can't say, because its opening is so narrow, so the assumption is that the vessel you can still be tovel. The water gets in here, and that's enough to say that it was immersed in the mikvah, even if we're going to say that the water here is not part of the mikvah, one unit with the mikvah water. It was still fully immersed in the mikvah, and the water did get into it. Okay, that would be that case. So then it would become tahor, even with a very narrow opening. So now we're saying this. So now, if in this tamei vessel, when this tamei, and you're going to dunk it in the mikvah, you put in your needles and so on, then the needles become tahor. How did they become tahor? Not because they're considered to be in the mikvah water. They're not in the mikvah water. They're only in the vessel. But since the vessel is becoming tahor, the status change that applies to the vessel also now applies to anything that's inside of the vessel. So the needles became tahor without ever having been considered to be themselves immersed in the mikveh water. They became tahor because they were inside of a vessel that was immersed, and when that vessel was changing its status, the status change applied to the needles as well. I actually thought once about using this as a solution to a problem that comes up with a woman going to the mikvah who has like an ear infection or other types of things, so you have to put something in the ear to specifically, its job is to keep water out. So how do you consider that not a chatzitza if it's specifically there for the purpose of keeping water out? And there are other types of scenarios like that, things like casts or whatever. Now it's less of an issue with the fiberglass, but sometimes it is the things that absolutely cannot get wet. So you have to put something on it to prevent it from getting wet. So how do you not call that thing a chatzitza? So some of these issues have been addressed, like the ear thing. There's a whole Rav Moshe tshuva on it, but some are not always so easy. So it occurred to me, you'll think this is absurd, but okay, that what you do is you create a vessel. Although I don't know, it might be too big to be considered a clay, but you create a vessel that basically somebody can go into, okay? And you have two vessels, one in another, okay? So basically, the water, and you immerse, and you make this outer one tameh. So the water goes here, this is tameh, and this is tameh, and the woman is tameh, and then you don't have to get wet at all. Because you immerse the whole thing in. You have to be in an inner vessel here, or you'll get, you know what I'm saying. But the inner one is also tameh. Okay, so the inner vessel and the woman, are not, are protected from the water. And since the tefillah works for the outer vessel, it works for the woman and the water, so you get to go to the mikveh without ever getting wet. That was my idea. The only I don't know that we could say if it's just because it works for vessels, it works for people. Although logically, I don't see why not. But the other question is that if you have a vessel that big, it might not be considered a vessel. So we have to still figure out if I can make that work. Then I have to get someone to design it and make it. Yes.
Does this work for earthenware vessels where we make the distinction between the outside and the inside?
Well, earthenware vessels, you can't be metaher. So that's in the mikveh anyway.
Yeah,
Okay. So anyway, so that's that. So in that case, you would not need there to be a wide opening. You could have it become tahor without ever actually having been considered to have been in the mikveh water, because of what applies to the outer vessel. Okay. As we taught in the Mishnah, kalim shemilan kalim. If you filled vessels with vessels, v'hit bilan, and you immerse them, hare elu tahorim, they're tahor. Lo taval, and if you did not immerse them, then the water has to be combined like the size of this tube. So what does that mean? If you didn't immerse them, the water has to be combined. That doesn't make any sense. So the Gemara says, "My kamar vim lo taval." What do you mean if you didn't immerse them? You can't even read that. That doesn't make any sense. No, hachi kamar. We may not tzarich lat bilo. If the outer one doesn't need to be immersed, meaning if the outer one needed to be immersed because it was tameh, then it'll automatically be mitaher any vessel that's inside of it. When the outer one becomes tahor, the inner one will become tahor. That's if the outer one needed to be immersed. But if the outer one did not need to be immersed, if the outer one was tahor, then the inner ones only become tahor if the water is connected by an opening the size of this tube. So if again you have these vessels in a narrow mouthed outer vessel, if the outer vessel needed to go to the mikvah, needed to be immersed, then it works for the outer, it works for the inner. If the outer one did not need to be immersed, it was tahor, it only works for the inner if the opening is the size of the shofaris hanod. Okay, and now the Gemara sort of ends this point. The Had Rav Rabbi Ilah, this debate of Rav and Rabbi Ilah, whether the reason is chatzitza or whether the reason is because of a vessel, of a concern of a narrow opening, Tanaihi, is based on a debate of Tanayim. The time we talk about the Brisa, Salve Gorgasni Shamilan Kailin Vit Bilan, and you took this big basket, wicker basket that you filled with vessels, Bein the Kodesh, Bein the Truma, even for Kodesh purposes, let alone for Truma, Tahorim is fine. When you're dealing with a basket, this level does not apply. Abba Shol, that's like Rava. But then comes along Abba Shol, Omer L'Truma Avolo L'Kodesh. No, that's still the difference of levels still applies. That only works for Truma, not for Kodesh. So exactly this issue of basket is debated. So it seems that the explanation is what is the underlying reason? Is the reason like Rava, a concern of narrow-mouthed vessels, or is the reason like Reb Ilah, a concern of one vessel weighing down on the other one? So the Gemara now finally, so that's the two explanations. Now the Gemara
It doesn't give us these
reasons, right? Rav and Rabbi gave us the reason. Now the Gemara gets around to saying, so okay, these all seem legitimate reasons. Either one vessel will weigh down, or there'll be a narrow opening. So if it applies to Truma, if it applies to Kodesh, it should apply to Truma. This is a legitimate concern. Yes.
That's what I understand how Flowing takes a lot. You have this very narrow vessel, you put it in the mikvah, but it's exactly 40 sa'ah.
Yeah.
Then you're stuck, right? Then if you take it out, you possible mikvah now is less than that. Even if you pour it back in, the water would never be my sugar.
That might be if it's exactly 40 sa'ah. You raise a good question, which is it possible with a narrow opening, the water would still not, inside the vessel would not be considered not part of the mikvah to reduce its 40 sa'ah minimum, but it wouldn't be considered enough one unit that something inside of it could still be considered being immersed in the mikvah. There's possible middle stages, but you're right. It's possible in some scenarios it would be a problem. Absolutely. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay, so ihachi trumanami, whatever the reason is, whether it's the narrow mouth or whether it's weighing down, let it be a concern for truma. So the Gemara says no. Liman kamrinan, who's following these laws anyway of these different levels? Chaverim, they are, meaning chaver is in contrast to am haaretz, the people that are scrupulous about laws of Torah. So chaverim midiyadi. So chaverim know the laws, and they'll make sure that one vessel isn't weighing down the other, or that the mouth is big enough. So the Gemara says, if that's true, if you assume people know the laws here, so Kodesh Nami. So even when it's done for the purpose of Kodesh, you shouldn't have this restriction. So the Gemara says, no. There we're concerned, Chazile Amaaretz ve'azil matbil. No, we're concerned that, yes, you'll know what to do, but then the Amaretz is going to follow your example, and then when he immerses things for Kodesh, he'll do it also with one vessel in a vessel, and he won't know what to be careful about, and it'll lead to problems. So the Gemara says, okay, but if we're afraid that an Amaretz is going to follow your example, he'll follow your example by Trumas also. So the Gemara says, so one minute. So Truma nami chazil. So Truma also he'll follow your example and he'll do what you do for Truma for his Truma. Truma says no. There we have an answer. Lo mekablin and minayu. We don't take Truma from Am Haaretz. If an Am Haaretz comes to a Chaver Kohen to give him Truma, he'll say, why don't you give it to your friend, the Kohen Am Haaretz? Don't give it to me. Okay, which is lovely, which again gets to this issue of creating these, divisions in society. So okay, he might actually misunderstand, copy us in an incorrect way, and it'll lead to him not being careful by Truma. But it won't affect us because we're not going to eat the Truma he's going to give us. So why are we not concerned that he'll also follow our example by how to deal with things for Kodesh? And so I'm sorry. So therefore, excuse me. So why? So then for by Kodesh also, why do we have to have this higher level? Let's just say we won't accept korbanos from him. But obviously, there's a big difference. Truma, we can tell him give it to another Kohen who's an Am Haaretz Kohen. I the Kohen Chaver won't take it. But if he comes with a korban, we can't say bring it in your own Beis Hamikdash. There's only one Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so that's why we have to be careful that he doesn't follow we don't have to be so careful he doesn't follow our example by Truma, because we're able to keep these divisions of practice around Truma. But by Korbanot and Kodshim, where we can't keep divisions of practice, we have to be he's going to look at us, what we do when we handle things for Korbanos purposes, and he'll follow that example. Presumably he knows enough to know that there would be different standards between Truma and Korbanot, so he'll be very careful to focus on what example we're setting in the Korbanot area and follow that. And there we have to be very careful to set the right example, because we'll have no way that we can say we're not going to accept what you're bringing to the Beis Hamikdash. Yes.
There's an entire Masechta Demai that's based on the principle that some are trusted with Truma or aren't trusted with Meiser.
Yes, but that's when you're not receiving the Truma from them. That's when you're receiving the grain from them and you assume that they've removed the Truma. Okay, so then you can assume that it has the Truma removed so you can eat the grain. But that's different than the Amart's coming and saying, here's the Truma, Mr. Kohen, please take this, and that you're expected to eat it. Yes.
What Kodesh are we talking about? It's an animal, can't be.
No, so that's why I said before, wine and oil are the most obvious examples. There'll also be a mincha, or wine and oil for the nesachim that goes with the korban, right? Okay.
Meaning, you buy the wine at the Beit Hamikdash there, you still put it in your vessel.
Yeah, and you don't have to buy it in the Beis Hamikdash there, although you're right, that is normally what's done. Okay, so that's the Gemara's answer, okay? And also, again, fascinating that, you think he's an Am Haaretz, he's not so aware. It's not even visible. Are you dunking the thing in the mikvah for Truma or for Kodesh? You got to know a lot to understand, you just have to have information, like, visually seeing something won't tell you why it's being dunked, and you have to know enough to realize that there might be different standards adhering for one or the other, right? To the point that the Gemara can say, the Am Haaretz will look at what we're doing for Truma, and maybe be misled, but we don't care because they'll just follow it in terms of how they handle Truma, but we can't let them be misled. But then they'll look what we're doing for Kodesh, and we have to make sure they're not misled, but they're going to follow a distinct example that we set for Kodesh in terms of how they handle Kodesh, which to me seems a little bit hard to imagine, but okay. So let's take a look. So the Gemara says like this. So Kodesh Nami Lo Nekabu Minayu. So, okay, why should we care what example we set for Kodesh? Let's not accept, the stuff they bring for us in their vessels that are korbanot. So Havile Ava. No, there'll be enmity. They'll say, "Oh, you're not accepting my stuff." So Truma Nami Havile Ava. So there's enmity by Truma. We're not accepting. We're not good enough for you by the Truma. You won't take our Truma. Lo ich pasle. The Azu Yavle Lekoin Amars. Nah, there's not so much enmity. All right, he won't take my Truma. I'll give it to another, my friend, the Kohen Amaretz. Yeah, as if that won't cause any Ava. Like, you're not good enough for you, but good enough for one of my friends. Anyway, but at least somebody will take his Truma, so it won't lead to so much Ava. But by Korbanot, it's a different story. There's nothing else he can do with it, and he's being completely rejected. Okay, and now the Gemara spells that out. Uman the Tana dechayesh le'eva, which is the Tana that's concerned by Eva for Am Haaretz, specifically around Korbanot. Reb Yossi, it's Reb Yossi. The Tana we turn to Brisa. I'm Reb Yossi. Neima hakol nemanim altaras yain v'shemen kol yemos shana. Why are people believe for the purity of wine and oil all the days of throughout the year? Meaning there are times, maybe specific times during the regel where people are believed about everything. That's what we're getting up to. But when somebody brings wine and oil to the Beis Hamikdash at any time, not even the regel during the year, we assume it's tahor. And by the way, notice the irony, right? We have all of these ma'alot, we have all of these things, but all of a sudden somebody's coming to bring the holiest thing to the Beis Hamikdash, and we completely just accept their trustworthiness on it, right? So it's quite fascinating how it completely undermines, right, all these things and it's similar to the idea of the regel, of the way of really the need of not, creating really like a completely separate class of people. So why is everybody believed when they bring wine and oil to the Beis Hamikdash any time in the year? Because if you don't accept them in the Beis Hamikdash and they're going to want to bring korbanot, what are they going to do? They'll build their own little, bama, their own little altar in their backyard. You won't take me to the Beis Hamikdash? Fine, I'll bring it. Make my own altar. Okay, the Sorif Paraduma. I'm not tahor enough for you. Fine, I'll bring my own paraduma. Okay, so you don't want to sort of, do the types of things that are going to reject people to the point that they basically feel like they're going to go off on their own and do their own thing. Okay, and there's a very interesting thing about this in terms of contemporary realities, right? About how much, what type of divisions do we make, amongst Klal Yisrael that make people feel that they have no connection to, certain segments of the people. Fine, we'll just go do our own thing. And this is even a bamalatzmo to God, let alone that they might go worship in who knows what type of a temple. Okay, so Amar of Papa, so there's only one Beis Hamikdash, so you better do what you need to do to make people feel like they have a place in the Beis Hamikdash. Amar of Papa, and therefore, if we're going to do that anyway, we got to be careful to be setting the right standards. Okay, so it's one thing to trust them, but at least we have to present the right standards, so we'll at least make it better. Then we'll assume that they maybe can trust them to have followed it, and therefore we have to be more careful by Kodesh. Amar Rav Papa says, Rav Papa will just wrap this up. According to what approach do we accept testimony nowadays from an Am Haaretz? Normally, Am Haaretz, besides Truma and Tara, were considered to be, generally like, certainly less scholarly, but maybe also in some ways less careful about, either honesty or less careful about paying attention to the things they needed to pay attention to in order to be considered as legitimate witnesses. And nowadays we do accept them as witnesses. Who does that follow? Kiman Reb Yossi, like Reb Yossi, who says that this concern of Ava is a very dominant concern and lets us override other types of reasons that we would reject Am Haaretz. So in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, rejection means you're not accepted from the Beis Hamikdash. what are the areas of rejection nowadays that we're most sensitive to? So somebody that can't even like be a trusted witness in a court and is a really way of basically completely rejecting the person. So we have to override that law so that does not lead to a sense of complete rejection. And again, what you're seeing here is an amazing thing, right? So on the one hand, the Mishnayos are making all of these different levels, but like today's daf, I mean, we're Amud ahead, but anyway, the Amud today ends with a point that you could have radical difference, you could have these concerns about all of these areas, but if there's this issue that they're going to basically completely feel rejected and maybe completely lead to a split, then you override all those concerns. So even in something as weighty as the Beis HaMikdash or as serious as testimony, and we're not limiting it to Beis HaMikdash, the importance is now we're extending it. So again, when you get to the rabbinic period, all these issues of Amma Aretz and these multiple levels or whatever, most of them have faded in the background. I mean, so sure, there are discussions in the Gemara, but they tend to really be historical discussions. The reality of it has basically faded in the background, partly because there's no Mikdash and Tum and Tara concerns are less, but partly also because the same thing that we're going to get to in the end by the regel, a desire to create unity, here you're seeing other types of things that are pushing to sort of, to say, what is the cost of these types of distinctions, and to be real, and sometimes, the cost is much too big to be paying. Do you want to say something?
Note that the paradigm here is located in the two institutions around which Jewish life is organized, the Beit HaMikdash and the Beit Din.
Right. Although it is interesting that, again, like, I don't know if without the example of the Eidos, I would have said Beit Din would have been my obvious thing. I mean, I would tend to say the Beis HaMedrash and Torah, or, maybe Beit HaKnesset and so on. So, but yes, I mean, I think that's
where like Amcha comes in, like everybody's got to get to it.
that's true. That is true. Okay, so great.